Now, from an agenda perspective, we primarily have, as you can see here, six main points. I'd say five with a demo that we're covering. So the first and foremost is, what is the asset management capabilities? Why is it important? How is it different than, for example, the Dynamics 365 field service product? What are some of the basic concepts, a demonstration, and then finally, really what is in the future for EAM that you should be considering as well as you go through this. So kind of with that, let's get into this. So first off, what is enterprise asset management, what we call EAM? You're going to hear different terms for this. Asset management. Some people call it preventative maintenance, right? There's just a lot of different terms that are out there, but the net result is basically maintaining internal assets and machines along with the spare part inventory for those given machines and resource needs. So EAM inside of Dynamics allows us to track all of that, not just from a fixed asset or a manufacturing asset perspective or resource perspective, but from a maintenance asset perspective, so that we can generate, for example, maintenance requests then for that asset or work orders or create preventative maintenance schedules that are related to it. And then finally, take all the costs that are related to those maintenance activities and then reflect those inside of the general ledger as typically some type of expense or some type of value that we may want to capitalize inside of the environment. There's a lot more beyond this as well. Asset management for others might be spare part inventory management. It may be being able to take older machines and produce, for example, jigs for that machine to fix or repair it using production capabilities inside of Dynamics 365. So the cool thing about this is because it's inside of the Dynamics 365 supply chain product, we can use a lot of those great capabilities then to really drive your business process and optimize it as you really tackle those asset maintenance requests inside of your organization. How does it help you is kind of the question I typically get. And I think a maintenance tech is going to be like, it's pretty self-explanatory. But at the same point, you'd be surprised at how many manufacturers do not do more complex preventative maintenance or asset management inside of their environment. So an example of that would be different types of assets need to be tracked internally, and then spare part inventory needs to be maintained, right? Well, if you have a maintenance asset and you have the list of spare parts and you have work orders that are out there, you can drive demand so that the system can automatically replenish, as you can imagine, some of that inventory. So it really allows you to track those assets, where they're installed, what the hierarchy is that's related to them, to be able to really get to that information. It also really helps you to understand what the financial position is for those given assets. What are the total repairs that have been done against it? What was the acquisition cost because you did turn it into a fixed asset, plus all the maintenance costs that occurred as well. So this allows you to track that detail, especially when you couple it with Dynamics 365 Finance, to really get to a complete picture as to what your asset cost is going to be. But then there's also the operational maintenance requirements that are there as well. And what I mean by that, as you can imagine, is that the operational requirement of reordering inventory for spare parts is native inside of the solution, or for scheduling downtime, as you can imagine, as well inside of there. That's another component that's here, right? Where you may want to then influence, as you can imagine, really what that downtime requirement is going to be so that planning can replan those orders. And finally, that's the other thing here, right? The potential impact in the production processing. If you have a work order for an asset that's going to be down for a couple days because of some large repair that may need to happen, and you're using the MRP planning capabilities inside of the solution, it will respect the downtime requirements that are there so that that machine and the work that was scheduled for it can actually be moved potentially to another machine depending upon your resource setups inside of manufacturing. So it provides a very rich integration into the inventory system that you typically don't get then with a standalone preventative maintenance solution. So this just goes even further, as you can imagine, and allows for a lot of that great capability of the standard solution to be used. Examples of that, just kind of at a high level, maybe some of these assets are huge assets that you need to schedule transportation for to be able to move them or repair them, or to buy the parts that are related to them. Well, because we have advanced warehouse management and transportation management that's built into Dynamics 365 supply chain, you can use those capabilities. You can use demand planning capabilities, for example, that actually use machine learning algorithms to forecast what the demand requirements is going to be based upon the historical usage that you've had as well. And that has nothing to do with asset management. That's all the inventory management perspective of binding basically supply and demand inside of the system. So it really brings you to a whole new level when it comes to how can you actually track these costs, the inventory requirements, and really unify then a lot of those operations as you go through that processing. So the question I get pretty commonly too is how is EAM different than field service? Because if you look at the Microsoft products, you've probably seen Dynamics 365 field service, and then you look at EAM and you're like, well, why do you have two of them? Well, high level, let's just say one is really designed for internal assets and one is designed for external assets. So EAM focuses on internal assets. The reasons for that, resources from a production perspective. Field service doesn't know about MRP. Field service very little knows about inventory because it has a very basic inventory system compared to supply chain. So it doesn't have that depth of integration into the purchasing, into the bidding, for example, and some of those details that are typically needed more often for then internal parts management for assets inside of your organization. So that's a really critical component here to note is that if you want to over summarize it in your head, internal versus external, internal EAM, external is going to be then field service. Now, I always get caught on this generalizations. We all know how those go, right? Well, the net result is that we can use those tools in some given circumstances to then, for example, use field service to address internal operations as well. But just like I said, that's kind of the rule I'd say, or the golden rule related to it. Mind you, as you talk with us more in detail, we can actually define a little bit further as well for you on that. The other thing to note here is that even though they both support a lot of the same concepts, so field service does assets, they've got installed locations, spare parts or bombs that are related to it, mobile interfaces, work orders, and IoT. What it doesn't have then are going to be features that are more specific than to an internal asset. Fixed asset integration isn't going to be in field service. Spare parts management from a reordering requirement perspective, where we want to use planning optimization and min maxes and some of the more complex replenishment methods are not going to be in field service, but they're going to be in EAM. And then finally, some of the business process needs that are typically needed for maintenance teams, such as maintenance rounds. When you have a shift change, for example, you want to have someone go through all those different machines and maybe do a quick check before the shift starts because maybe those rounds will create requests or work orders. Well, that's a native capability inside of EAM, and that concept doesn't exist at all inside of field service. So these are just kind of examples as to where those differences are. But like I said, the generalization is typically internal is going to be EAM, and then external is going to be then, as you can imagine, the field service product. Now, what are the basic parts then when we start talking about the enterprise asset management capabilities? So first and foremost, we've got the asset, right? So the asset can actually be in a hierarchy as well. We can do what's called a parent and a child. We can't do parent-child, parent-child. It's only parent-child for the relationship. But we can then use functional locations to build a more complex hierarchy inside of Dynamics 365 as well. And this is all configuration, so it doesn't require us to customize it. So I can have an extruder, I can have the main extruder, for example, as a parent, and I can have the child assets that are related to it. And I can have those child assets then installed in different locations. So when I look at a hierarchy of that machine, I can see exactly where those assets are installed. And that's the combination here. We use assets and functional locations to denote what the asset is or what the sub-asset is related to it, and then where is that asset located inside of your manufacturing facility. A functional location does not equate to an inventory location because they are different, and maintenance teams also look at that differently as well because we're not typically holding inventory in those given areas from a physical representation. We may be consuming to it to be in WIP, but we're not actually maintaining that in that regard as well. And then finally, obviously, we've got maintenance requests, work orders, and schedules that we're dealing with. Maintenance requests, as we can imagine here as well, are things that allow us basically to create break fix type events that we want screened as a maintenance team before they become a work order. Most maintenance team managers love this capability because what they want to do is they want to separate the user community requests from, as you can imagine, then work orders that may be made by technicians that should be able to create those for some type of break fix event, as you can imagine. So a maintenance request allows for an end user really to create a request that can then go through an approval process that allows you then to convert that into a work order. And like I said, it's more common for maintenance requests to be generated basically from corrective actions or those break fix scenarios that you may have inside of your environment. Now, you don't need to start with maintenance requests. You can also do what we call work orders inside of the system. Now, the main difference with work orders really revolves around the fact that work orders are typically where the rubber hits the road. It's where we align the resource requirements in terms of the labor, the material requirements for the spare parts inventory, the time entry, the posting, the financial impact of it. That's what the work orders do inside of the system. We can have different statuses that are related to those work orders, but the key thing here is that when we schedule downtime, for example, that may impact production, a work order is typically the vehicle that we use to do that. So that way those capacity reservations are reserved to the work order and not to then individual manufacturing jobs that are out there. And then finally, like I said before, work orders can also be generated from preventative maintenance plans. So you can actually go through and then set up a maintenance plan related then to your asset. And then from there, as it gets to that date, it'll generate that work order for you based upon what's inside of that maintenance schedule. That kind of leads us in then into our preventative maintenance perspective here as well, as you can imagine. So another cool concept for preventative maintenance. Maintenance schedules are what we use to be able to drive that. So they generate obviously those work orders. We can also do two different concepts when it comes to the preventative maintenance capabilities inside of Dynamics 365. First and foremost, we can actually go through and allow for date-driven and counter-driven maintenance plans inside of the system. So the example I love to give with this is typically a water filter. Most of you will replace a water filter every quarter, every year, right? That's a pretty typical requirement. But most people don't know that filters are rated off of volume of flow that goes through it to remove those contaminants, right? Cubic feet of water, for example, might be the measurement that you use for that. But the net result is that a filter is tested so that at a certain point, it will actually, no longer do the filtration, right? Because it has been fully saturated basically as part of that filter. Now, with date-driven scenarios, if you're replacing it every quarter, for example, basically, if there's any downtime or any flow changes based upon what you were anticipating, you may be replacing that filter early, right? And if you think about it from an asset management perspective, that can technically increase your cost over the lifespan of that product. And maybe every quarter it's minor, but if you start looking at some of the bigger machines and you look over the useful life, which a lot of machines at manufacturer facilities, I've seen 10, 15-year-old machines, even older than that, that are constantly used for these production scenarios. Well, as you can imagine, that can be a pretty major cost for an organization. So being able then to use what we call counter-driven maintenance plans allow for us to basically take details of the cubic feet per minute that flowed through that filter to then calculate what was the volume of filtration so that if there was any reduction in that flow rate, well, we're not going to replace it till we hit that manufacturer's stated capacity flow that they support for that filter. The other example would be counter-driven maintenance plans for cars, right? Vehicles, odometers, right? Your 50,000 mile tune-up, your 100,000 mile tune-up, right? Those are examples as well of counter-driven ones as part of that. So just something to note is that we support both of those. We can automatically create those work orders. We can group work orders based upon where the assets are located or the functional location related to it, right? We can use a very similar process as well to the break fix, where we have a request that becomes a work order. Well, we have a maintenance schedule that becomes a work order, and there's a type differentiator for the work order. So you know what is something that is a break fix versus what is something that was actually generated from a maintenance schedule. And finally, IoT, right? IoT. Here's my little device I have. This is a ESP32. I've got 8266s as well. These devices are just so amazing. $2, be able to connect to Wi-Fi, have it so it actually can track, for example, additional details regarding that particular asset. Examples in my house, every single room in my house has one of these that has temperature monitors, humidity, barometric pressure that I actually gather the data for, and I create events off of it. An example of that would be if my garage gets to a certain temperature because I have an electric car, it opens up the garage and turns on a fan to actually help reduce then that heat inside of there. So there's just a whole bunch of things that you can do with IoT that can then natively provide that counter-based detail, as you can imagine, for your assets so that the system can automatically generate then those work orders for you based upon those counter requirements that you put inside of preventative maintenance plans. So there's a lot of cool things here, and these aren't super techy. This is like I felt it was super techy 7 years ago when I started getting into it. Now this is pretty common, and a lot of manufacturers are looking at plans and ideas of how to either implement, for example, this little ESP32 chip, or they're building their own, as you can imagine, more complex IoT capable devices that relay that information from their internal manufacturing environment. So a lot of great capabilities that can be then driven off of these preventative maintenance plans. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into Dynamics 365 and kind of cover some of those capabilities so you can see like what is the asset management capabilities inside of Dynamics 365. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my finance and operations environment. This is Dynamics 365 supply chain. I am an administrator. I demo all the time. I've got lots of different areas here. Typically, you're going to see maybe one or two of these workspaces in your environment when you're interacting then, for example, with a given role. But I do want to highlight something. So if I expand my navigation pane here, and then I go to my modules and I click on my asset management, you can see that there's just a plethora of information here that you can use to be able to manage then these assets in your organization. You've got requests, you've got work orders, you've got pooling that you can do for work orders to do better grouping. You've got procurement processes that you can build into this. You've got loaning that you can do along with inbound and outbound asset tracking that you can actually have. You've got capacity from a schedule perspective that you can maintain. You've got your faults, your reasons, your symptoms as well from an asset work request as well. You've got bombs that are related to it. You've got different life cycles, different warranties that you may have, right? So I'm just highlighting, there's just a lot of stuff inside of here, right? Now, from an end user perspective, if you think about it, it's like, well, wait a second, Scott, my maintenance team is not going to be able to work with something like that. And I 100% agree with you. Instead, typically, when you go through and you implement the asset management capability, you're using then these workspaces to interact, obviously, with that data. So if I were a user and I was actually going to do a maintenance request that would request a team to fix something like a break fix scenario, I typically would be working inside of this maintenance request management where I would create then a maintenance request. And then from there, the maintenance manager would get a notification and then they would do something with that. Do they assign a tech? Do they add it to an existing work order? Do they cancel it because it's not an issue? So on and so forth, right? There's different scenarios that drive that. But this maintenance request workspace allows me then to interact with it from that regard. Now, if I were a maintenance manager or even a tech for that matter, I would probably work inside of the work order management section here, right? Where, for example, I have a list on the far left here of all the different types of maintenance requests that need to be approved that have been submitted by end users. But at the same time, then I have work orders that are, as you can see here, unscheduled, where I haven't gone through the resource planning to actually align then the individuals that will be doing that work. Or as you can see here as well, I may need to go into see what's delayed, right? Because my actual start time might be different than my estimated start time, right? So there's just a lot of great capabilities here then from a maintenance tech and maintenance manager perspective, along with what you would expect, which is, hey, I want to have more detailed reporting inside of Dynamics 365 as well. As you can see here, from a maintenance perspective, you can use Power BI to really create some amazing charts, graphs, and interactions then as to where those pieces of equipment are, and then what you're doing, obviously, to maintain those and what those costs are that are potentially related to it. So there's a lot of great capability in that regard as well from an analytics perspective that you can use as part of this. Now, one of the things I wanted to crack open for you really was an asset because I think that that speaks volumes as to, what is the setup and what are the capabilities? And not to overwhelm, but there's quite a bit here, right? And that's the cool thing about this. So if I go, for example, to an extruder here that I have, and I click on that particular extruder, I get a detail card that pops up here that I can then interact and see additional details about this extruder. An example would be if I want to save some screen real estate is I can actually go ahead and collapse the action pane here. On the far right, I have then what we call fact boxes that contain additional details about that particular asset. I can see, for example, the child assets that are related to this. I can see work orders that have been assigned to this asset. I can see the preventative maintenance schedule inside of this particular asset as well as some of the additional details, such as maybe counters that are being maintained or any assets that we may be loaning as well. Because, like I said, there are scenarios where maybe you do want to use asset management to do that loan portion of it. Now, the other important thing here from an asset perspective is the fact that it does support what we call a parent-child relationship. So we can see those given particular child assets that are related to it. But what it also supports, if I really quickly just go to my favorites here and look at my asset view, is a more complex hierarchy that you may use to be able to determine where given locations are and assets are installed. So a lot of people, what they used to do is they'll use just parent child, parent child. They want to do it in that structure. Well, you can still do that. You just use the location to physically denote then where that asset is installed, but it's still a part of then that child asset for the main extruder inside of here. So you can do, as you can imagine, some pretty complex hierarchies that then denote exactly where these particular assets are installed. Now, the cool thing about these functional locations then as well is the fact that you can actually then have attributes that are related to these particular assets. You can actually take this and then go even further with these attributes, these location types. And based upon these location types, what you can also do is you can actually set up maintenance plan based upon the type of asset as well. So this is a really important concept because when we look at an asset, a lot of people are used to the concept that when I go into, for example, my assets, so we'll go back to our all assets here, and when I have an extruder here, what I need to do is I need to set up a maintenance schedule related to this for this specific asset. Well, you don't have to do that inside of Dynamics 365. You can do a generic incident-based type response where based upon the asset type, then that maintenance plan is used, or based upon where it's located from a functional location, you do that particular maintenance. So if it's outside, maybe there's some outdoor activity that needs to occur for it, right? So it provides a lot of those great capabilities inside of here to be able to drive that. Now, the other thing I wanted to highlight is the maintenance plans themselves, right? So for this given asset, I can have tons of just custom fields from an attribute perspective. I've got notes, makes, and models. In this example, I even have attachments that actually have then the original purchase order that I used to buy this particular asset. But if I go down here just a little bit further and I take a look then at, for example, that maintenance plan and we view the details of that maintenance plan, this is where I can then go through and then define how do I want the maintenance to occur for this given asset. So if I just, as an example, do a new and delete just to get the list cleared here, you can see that I've got a preventative maintenance extrusion scenario that I cover here. And inside of that, you can see that by time every week, I have a particular maintenance plan that's going to generate a work order that I'm going to need to then tackle. And what's cool about this is you can do more complex scenarios too. So for our generators, as an example, we have a weekly and then an annual preventative maintenance that is time-based inside of here. And what happens is that the system will actually go through and schedule these, but if the actual weekly occurs at the same time of the annual, it won't do the weekly, it'll just do the annual for it. So like I said, there's some really cool things that you can do from a maintenance plan perspective. And the net result of those maintenance plans is that they're going to go through here and then drive, as you can see, every week, then really the preventative maintenance that needs to occur as you go through that processing. So kind of gone through assets, functional locations. Let's crack open a work order so you can kind of see that as well. So I'm going to close out of here. I'm actually going to go into my work order management, and we're going to look at all of our work orders that are inside of the system by going down to the bottom and basically going through and then clicking on my all work orders. And what I'll do here is I'll just click on it like that. And we can see all of our work orders that are inside of here. And basically, if I crack open one of these work orders, we'll actually do, as an example, the extruder preventative maintenance that's on side of here. Well, this is where I can then start doing some of that work, right? So a work order, for example, I can actually go through and then order. I can do a requisition because maybe I don't have permissions to directly do a purchase order and I have to go through an approval process. So I do a requisition. Or maybe I can do a purchase order, or maybe I need to build a jig, or maybe I need to build a bunch of jigs to fix basically this particular product, right? So I can actually denote the supply requirements for this particular work order. Maybe there's expendable parts that are needed as well that are used whenever I do the maintenance, such as gaskets or filters and things of that nature, that automatically add to here as well, right? So this work order is really where we can track that detail. And then what we can also do from a work order perspective is then interact and then tell the system what was the impact then of those given requirements, right? So just as an example here, as I open up my journal, it might be a little bit slow to start here, I can go ahead and then put in time. I can add items to it that I consumed with it. And then if I went to Home Depot or Lowe's or some hardware store to pick something up and used my credit card for it, I can expense that against the work order as well to track that cost so it goes into that asset. So there's a lot of great capabilities in that regard that you can use to drive that as well. And then finally, as part of this processing, obviously mobility is a critical component here. And I just want to kind of highlight that. So I'm going to go ahead and move over my mobile experience here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into the finance and operations mobile app, and I'm going to click on my asset management inside of here. And here's what's really cool about this is that I can access as a maintenance team tech, which is usually the person that's interacting with this. I can come in here, for example, and look at my work orders. So I've got a filter that needs to be corrected inside of here for a jet filter for work order 26. And you can see it even updates as we go through here to see, oh, there's another corrective action that needs to occur for this given work order. What are the details related to it, right? I can add additional lines that are related to it. I can see it's a forklift that needs to have that repair. I can see when it's scheduled, who the trade is that's required to actually do that repair, right? I can go through a checklist if there was one related to it, right? That actually would allow me then to basically step through all the different steps I need to do the repair. So this mobile experience allows for you to very easily and quickly interact and get to that data inside of Dynamics 365, but then from your phone. So really cool. Obviously, there's a lot more we can go through from a process perspective. I want to crack open a little bit with it, but where's the future for EAM? So here's where we see it going. We're going to see more IoT enablement. We have machines that need to be able to report back information on how many presses and cycles they've done. More and more customers are using then logic apps and some of those software solutions basically to update the counter information to reflect that. So just expect deeper IoT. The mobile app, even though it's great right now, is also going to be updated. So we're going to see a better mobile app capability as the platform aligns more than to the Power App capabilities inside of Dynamics 365. And then finally, there's been talk about it, and it's coming, AI enablement for pattern-based predictive maintenance. Imagine having different types of classifications of assets, sending that to an AI algorithm where it can then identify similarities where another machine might be affected by it, right? So this future is absolutely something that EAM is going to support, and we expect to see that obviously in the next year here to understand and use then that AI enablement for EAM.